The letters were burned deep into the old cedar post, two initials carved with a hot iron and pressed into the grain of the wood, as though whoever had done it wanted them to last longer than everything else on that lonesome stretch of prairie. And when Isaiah Abbott crouched down in the dying amber light of a September afternoon in 1882 and pressed his thumb into the grooves of those two letters, something shifted inside his chest that he could not rightly explain. PT, that was all. Just two letters, scorched into the corner post of a collapsing fence line that separated the open range from a long stretch of scrubland nobody seemed to have claimed. The post itself was weathered half to nothing, the wood turned silver-gray by years of sun and wind, but the brand was sharp and deliberate. Somebody had pressed that iron with patience and care. Somebody had wanted those initials to mean something. Isaiah straightened up to his full height, which was considerable, and pushed the brim of his hat back with one knuckle the way he always did when he was thinking hard about something he could not let go of. He was 28 years old, lean and brown from years of working cattle under the open sky, with dark eyes that had a habit of going very still and very quiet when something caught his attention in a way nothing else could. He had ridden out here to the far edge of the Callaway spread to check the fence line after reports of drifting cattle, and he had found what he expected to find: broken wire, a rotted post or two, evidence of animals pushing through from the northern range. He had done the work he was sent to do. He should have turned his horse around and ridden back to the bunkhouse before the last light was gone. He did not turn his horse around. He stood there in the fading gold of the afternoon, with the wind pressing against his back, and looked at those two initials, and felt something he had not felt in a long time: curiosity of a particular kind, the sort that was wrapped up in something warmer than curiosity, something that had no sensible name. He pulled out the small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket and wrote the letters down, though he knew perfectly well he would not forget them. PT, he wrote the location too, as best he could estimate it, 40 miles give or take from the town of Harlan Creek, out on the eastern edge of the range, where the grass gave way to rocky soil and scrub juniper. He noted that the brand was made with a small, careful iron, probably no wider than 2 fingers, and that it had been made recently enough that the wood had not grayed over the burn. 6 months, maybe, perhaps less. He did not know why any of this mattered. He only knew that it did. He rode back to the Callaway ranch in the dark, led his horse Calhoun into the corral, and lay in his bunk that night staring at the ceiling and thinking about 2 initials burned into an old fence post at the edge of the world, wondering what kind of person had put them there and why, and whether they were all right, whoever they were. By morning, he had made up his mind. He told old Garrett Callaway that he needed a few days for personal business, which was something he had never done in 3 years of working for the man, and Callaway looked at him with the particular squint of an employer who knows better than to argue with a man who has never once asked for anything. Isaiah packed his saddlebag with 3 days of provisions, filled his canteen from the well, and rode out before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills. He was going to find out whose initials those were. He had no particular reason beyond the one he carried in his chest, which was not reason at all but something older and more insistent than reason. He knew the land east of the Callaway spread in broad strokes. He knew the town of Harlan Creek, knew the stage road that cut through the scrublands, knew roughly which ranches and homesteads lay scattered across that 40-mile stretch of open country. What he did not know was which of those homesteads might be home to someone whose initials were PT, or why that person had branded their mark into an old fence post at the far edge of everything. He started at Harlan Creek. The town was not much: a main street with a mercantile, a livery, a small hotel that also served as the local saloon in the evening hours, a barber shop, and a land office that doubled as the post office. There was a church at the north end of town and a blacksmith shop at the south, and between them everything that passed for civilization in that corner of the New Mexico territory in the fall of 1882. Isaiah tied Calhoun outside the mercantile and went in. The man behind the counter was named Walt Prout, and Isaiah had met him twice before on supply runs. Prout was the kind of man who knew everyone in a 50-mile radius whether they wanted to be known or not, because a mercantile was the one place everybody eventually had to go. "Morning," Isaiah said, setting his hat on the counter. "I've got a question that might sound a little peculiar." Prout leaned on the counter with his elbows and gave him the look of a man who had heard a great many peculiar things and was not easily surprised. "Ask away." "I'm looking for someone whose name starts with PT, those initials. A woman, I'd guess, from the size of the brand." He paused, then added, because it needed saying, "Found her initials burned into a fence post out east of the Callaway spread, about 40 miles out. I just want to make sure she's all right." Prout was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Isaiah saw something cross the man's face, not quite recognition, but something in that neighborhood. "PT," Prout said slowly. "You know, there's a woman came through here about 8 months ago, set up on the old Draper homestead out on the East Range. Never did get her full story, but she paid for her supplies in cash money and kept to herself mostly. Name's Talbot, Pearl Talbot." The name settled into Isaiah like a stone into still water, sending rings outward in every direction. "Pearl Talbot, PT, she all right?" he asked. Prout shrugged in the way of a man who genuinely did not know. "Comes in every few weeks for supplies. Came in last about a month ago, maybe 6 weeks. Quiet woman, pretty in a serious sort of way. I don't ask folks their business." "The Draper homestead," Isaiah said. "That's out past Miller's Crossing, about 4 miles past. Follow the stage road east until you see the old windmill that doesn't turn anymore, then head south a half-mile. Used to be a good homestead, but Draper abandoned it 3 years back when his wife passed. Place has sat empty since." Isaiah put his hat back on. "I'm obliged to you." "You going out there?" Prout said, and there was something careful in his voice. "I am," Prout nodded slowly. "She's alone out there, far as I know. Take something useful if you go. Woman alone on that spread could use supplies more than a stranger showing up with nothing but questions." Isaiah bought flour, dried beans, salt pork, a good tin of coffee, and a small jar of honey because it seemed like the kind of thing a person living alone would run short of and miss. He packed it all into his saddlebag and rode east. The day was bright and cool with a wind coming down from the mountains that smelled of pine and coming autumn. The scrubland gave way to longer grass as he rode, and the sky above was the deep particular blue of the New Mexico territory in September, a color that existed nowhere else in the world, and that Isaiah had always privately considered to be one of the better arguments for staying where he was. Red-tailed hawks rode thermals above the mesas to the north. A jackrabbit bolted across the road ahead of Calhoun, and the horse flicked an ear but did not spook, which was one of the things Isaiah liked best about him. He rode for 3 hours before he saw the windmill Prout had described, a rusted tower standing motionless against the sky, its blades locked and going nowhere, the way things that have been abandoned long enough eventually go still. He turned south and found a 2-track trail through the grass that had been used recently enough to show fresh wheel ruts. His heart was doing something complicated in his chest that he had no business thinking about, given that he was riding out to check on a complete stranger based on nothing more than 2 letters burned into a piece of old wood. He told himself it was simply the decent thing to do. A woman alone on an isolated homestead, a brand that spoke of someone claiming a place for herself. Anyone with any human decency would want to make sure she was all right. He told himself that, and he mostly believed it. And then the homestead came into view over a low rise, and he pulled Calhoun to a stop. The Draper homestead was not much, but it was more than he had expected. Someone had been at work on it, that was clear from 50 yards away. The fence that had been collapsing along the southern property line had been repaired, the posts reset, and the wire newly strung and tight. The yard had been swept clean. The door of the small barn stood open, and 2 goats were visible inside. There was a kitchen garden on the eastern side of the house that had been planted with care. though the season was late and most of it had already gone to seed or been harvested. Most striking of all, the front porch of the old Draper house had been scrubbed clean of years of dirt and grime, and someone had placed 2 tin cans of dried wildflowers on either side of the door, with the kind of attention to small beautiful things that spoke of a particular kind of spirit. And then the woman herself appeared in the doorway. She had heard him coming. He was not surprised. Women alone learned to hear things. She stood in the frame of the door with a shotgun held loose but ready in both hands. And even at 50 yards, Isaiah could see that she knew exactly how to hold it and was not afraid to use it. She was watching him with the steady, measuring calm of someone who had learned to assess a stranger's intentions from a distance. He stopped Calhoun at the gate and took his hat off so she could see his face clearly. "Morning," he called, pitching his voice to Carrie without being loud. "I'm Isaiah Abbott. I work for the Calloway Ranch to the west. I come in peace, ma'am, and I mean that in the most literal way possible." He paused. "I also come with coffee and flour if that helps establish my good intentions." There was a long moment of silence. Then the woman's posture shifted, not relaxing entirely, but changing. She lowered the barrel of the shotgun a few degrees and took a step out onto the porch. "What do you want, Mr. Abbott?" she called back. Her voice was clear and direct, with a note in it like a struck bell, something that rang and then kept ringing after the initial sound. "I want to ask you something if you'll permit it, and to deliver these supplies if you'll accept them." Another silence. She was thinking it over, which he respected. A woman alone was right to think hard before letting a strange man into her yard. "Come through the gate slowly," she said, "and keep your hands where I can see them." "Yes, ma'am." He came through the gate slowly and kept his hands visible. When he got close enough to see her face clearly, something happened that he was not prepared for and would think about for a long time afterward. Pearl Talbot was perhaps 24 or 25 years old, with dark red-brown hair pinned up under a plain cotton bonnet that she wore pushed back from her forehead in a way that suggested she had more important things to think about than the proper placement of a bonnet. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they were looking at him with an intelligence and a wariness that he found immediately and completely arresting. She had a spray of light freckles across her nose and cheeks. Her hands on the shotgun were steady and capable. She was wearing a plain work dress with the sleeves rolled up, and there was a smear of something dark, oil, maybe, or axle grease, along her left forearm that suggested she had been in the middle of fixing something mechanical before he arrived. She was, he thought, in a quiet internal way he would never have said aloud, the most striking woman he had ever seen. "Mr. Abbott," she said in that bell-clear voice, "you said you had a question." He had almost forgotten. He cleared his throat and reached into his pocket for the leather notebook. "Yes, ma'am. I was out checking the fence line on the eastern edge of the Calloway spread, about 40 miles west of here. Found an old cedar post with 2 initials burned into it." He opened the notebook and held it out so she could see what he had written. "PT, I wanted to make sure the person who put them there was all right." For a long moment, Pearl Talbot looked at the notebook in his outstretched hand. Something crossed her face, surprise, and beneath the surprise, something more complicated. Her grip on the shotgun changed, not threatening, just different. She looked up at him with those gray-green eyes. "You rode 40 miles to check on the person who branded their initials into a fence post," she said. "Give or take," he said. "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" It was the question he had been asking himself since the previous afternoon, and he did not have a clean answer to it. He looked at her steadily. "Because it seemed like something that deserved following up on. The brand was careful and recent. It told me something about the person who made it, that they cared about marking something as theirs, about making a claim. And then I thought about how far from everything that post was, and I thought about all the ways a person can need something and have nobody close enough to notice." The quiet that followed his words stretched long enough that a mockingbird in the scrub oak at the edge of the yard went through half its repertoire. Pearl Talbot was looking at him the way a person looks at a thing they are trying to categorize, and finding that it does not fit neatly into any existing category. "Put your horse in the paddock," she said finally. "I'll make coffee." The inside of the house was small and spare, but remarkably alive. Every surface that could be made useful had been made useful: shelves built from rough-hewn boards and old crates, a worktable covered in tools and small mechanical parts that she had clearly been in the process of repairing, a bookshelf along one wall that held more books than he would have expected, a fireplace that still held the ash of a recent fire. A braided rug covered most of the floor. The tin cans of wildflowers outside were not the only evidence of her particular spirit. There was a pressed flower between glass on the windowsill, and a small pen-and-ink drawing of a mountain range tacked above the fireplace. The place smelled of coffee and cedar shavings and something herbal he could not identify. She boiled water on the iron stove and measured coffee with the authority of someone who knows exactly how strong coffee should be. She did not make small talk while she did this, and he did not push for it. He sat at the table where she gestured him to sit and waited, turning his hat in his hands, looking at the books on the shelf. There were novels and there were practical texts, a book on livestock husbandry, one on soil science, one whose spine read medical guide for the frontier household. There was a Bible, and there were 3 volumes of poetry. She set a cup in front of him and sat across the table with her own. "My name is Pearl Talbot," she said, with the formality of someone who has decided to proceed carefully. "I'm from Wichita. I came out here 8 months ago to take up this homestead." "On your own," he said, and then regretted the slight edge of surprised question in his voice because it was not his business and because she had every right to be here on her own if she chose. But she did not seem offended. "On my own," she confirmed evenly. "My father died 14 months ago. He was the last of my family. I had a small inheritance, enough to buy the provisions to make a go of a homestead. I had a choice between staying in Wichita and working as a seamstress for the rest of my days, or coming out here and trying to make something that was mine." She looked at him steadily over her coffee cup. "I chose this." "The fence post," he said, "at the edge of the Callaway spread." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but related to one. "I rode the boundary of what I could see from horseback when I first arrived. I wanted to know the land. When I got to that post, it seemed like the right place to put my mark. I knew it wasn't my land exactly, it was too far west, but it felt important. Like saying, I exist. I'm here. I've come this far and I'm not going back." She paused. "I didn't expect anyone to find it." "I almost didn't," he said. "The light hit it a particular way." She was looking at him with that calculating gray-green gaze. "You still haven't told me why you rode 40 miles. "I told you. You told me the practical reason," she said. "You didn't tell me the actual reason." He put his coffee cup down and looked at her with the same steadiness she was directing at him, because he was a man who did not flinch from honesty even when it made him uncomfortable. "Because something about those initials got into me and wouldn't let go," he said. "I don't know how to explain it better than that. I lay in my bunk thinking about those 2 letters and wondering about the person who put them there, and by morning it seemed plain that the only way to stop thinking about it was to come and see." Pearl Talbot looked at him for a long time. "That is either the strangest thing I've ever heard," she said, "or the most honest thing." "Probably some of both," he admitted. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. It was near enough. He stayed for 3 hours that first day. He helped her fix the thing she had been working on when he arrived, a water pump with a stuck valve, the source of the axle grease on her forearm. Because he had fixed enough pumps to know the particular obstinacy of a valve gone stiff, and because she accepted his help with the particular graceful practicality of someone who knows when to accept useful assistance. They worked side by side in the dry afternoon heat, trading instructions and information like 2 people who had been working together for years instead of hours, and Isaiah found himself struck repeatedly by the precision and intelligence of her mind, by the way she approached every problem with a calm and methodical attention that was entirely self-taught and entirely her own. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked at one point, gesturing at the pump mechanism. "Books," she said simply. "And doing things wrong until I figured out how to do them right. It's the only curriculum available out here." When the pump was working again, sending a clean, steady stream of water into the trough, she washed her hands and they stood side by side in the yard and watched the goats amble toward the water with the slow, determined dignity of goats who know the world exists to accommodate them. The afternoon light was going golden again, the same color it had been when he found those initials the previous day, and for a moment he was struck by the feeling that the world had been arranged to bring him here, which was a feeling he would not have admitted to anyone and which he dismissed as soon as he noticed it sensibly. "I should get on the road," he said. "There's a few hours of light left." "You'll ride 40 miles in the dark if you leave now," she said practically. "I've got a good horse." She looked at Calhoun, who was standing in the paddock with the complete philosophical peace of a horse who is content wherever he is. "He's a fine horse," she agreed. "But the road through the scrublands is rough at night. I have a hay loft." She said this with perfect matter-of-fact practicality, the offer of a hayloft being entirely without any other implication in the world of 1882, especially in the world of a self-sufficient woman who understood the geography of the territory. "It's what's sensible." "It is sensible," he agreed, because it was. He slept in the hayloft above the small barn, on a blanket he pulled from his saddlebag, listening to the goats move around below and the nighthawks calling in the dark sky, and he lay on his back with his hands behind his head and thought about a woman with gray-green eyes and a spray of freckles across her nose, and the kind of absolute self-possession that was rarer than gold in this world, and the thinking was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. He rode out the next morning after a breakfast of cornbread and salt pork that Pearl cooked without ceremony and served without fuss, eating at the same table in the same companionable, careful silence that had characterized most of their interaction. When he stood to go, he put on his hat and found that he could not quite bring himself to turn toward the door without saying something that he could not fully articulate. "I'd like to come back," he said. "Not to impose. To be useful if there's anything that needs doing, and to see how you get on, if that's agreeable to you." Pearl Talbot looked at him from across the table. The morning light was coming through the east window and it was doing something remarkable to the color of her hair. "You can come back," she said carefully, "if you understand that I'm not looking to be taken care of. I can manage this place." "I know you can," he said, and meant it completely. "Come back in 2 weeks," she said. "Bring yourself and bring that notebook of yours. You said you work fence lines. I need an opinion on whether the north fence is going to hold through winter or whether I need to restring it now." It was as practical and unsentimental an invitation as he had ever received, and he found it absolutely perfect. He rode back to the Callaway Ranch with his heart doing that complicated thing again and the name Pearl Talbot turning quietly in his mind like a coin in a pocket. He came back in 2 weeks, as agreed. He came back 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that. Each time he brought something, not gifts exactly, but useful things. He brought fence wire and good nails. He brought a bag of oats for the horses and a packet of late fall seeds from the mercantile in Harlan Creek that Prude had said were good for planting before the first frost. He brought a novel from his own small collection, a copy of an adventure story he had read twice over and found genuinely excellent, thinking she might enjoy it, and she took it with a surprise in her eyes that she quickly smoothed over with practicality. She read it in 4 days and had opinions about it that she delivered at length on his next visit, sitting across the table from him in the afternoon light, making arguments with the focused energy of someone who has been living alone with her thoughts long enough to be extremely glad to have someone worth directing them at. He argued back because he had his own opinions and because he found that she wanted him to push back, that she had no patience for a man who simply agreed with her, which was itself remarkable, and which he filed carefully in the growing catalog of things he admired about her. On his fourth visit, in late October, they walked the north fence line together in the long light of a Thursday afternoon, and she told him things she had not told him before about her father, who had been a schoolteacher in Wichita with a love of books and a faith in the potential of the open land that he had never been able to act on himself, but had given entirely to his daughter. About her mother, who had died when Pearl was 12. About the particular quality of solitude that had been her life in Wichita after her father's death, the way the city had seemed to close in around her, the way she had looked at the land office advertisements for homestead claims and felt something open up in her chest for the first time in years. "I was afraid," she said, which she said with the directness of someone who has made peace with fear rather than hiding it. "I was afraid every day for the first 3 months I was here. I didn't know if I could do this." "But you could," he said. "I could," she agreed, and there was a quiet pride in her voice that was not arrogance but something cleaner and deeper, the pride of someone who has proved something to themselves and knows it. He was quiet for a moment, walking beside her on the rough grass, the fence wire bright in the afternoon sun. "Why the fence post?" he said. "Specifically that post so far out?" She was quiet for a moment too. "Because it was the farthest I could see from here on the first day," she said. "It was the edge of my horizon. I needed to leave something there that said I'd seen it and wasn't afraid of it." She paused. "I know it sounds foolish." "It doesn't sound foolish at all," he said. "It sounds like the kind of thing a person does when they're claiming something important." She looked at him sideways, the sage-and-drain color of her eyes catching the light. "You're a strange man, Isaiah Abbott. People have said worse," he said. She laughed then, really laughed, for the first time in all his visits, a sound that started somewhere deep and came out bright and clear, and Isaiah Abbott felt it in his chest the way you feel a struck match when there is something ready to light. He came back in November. He came back in December. The visits were longer now. He would arrive on a Friday, spend the day helping with whatever the homestead required, sleep in the hayloft, and ride back Saturday evening. They talked in the way that people talk when they have found in each other a rare and complete willingness to be honest, which is different from and better than most other kinds of talking. She told him about books she loved, and he told her about the stretch of Arizona territory he had worked cattle in before coming to New Mexico, the particular light over the desert in the mornings, the way the silence of big, empty land could be either crushing or liberating, depending on the day. She told him about the injustice of how hard it was to hold a homestead claim as a single woman, how the men at the land office looked at her with a kind of patient disbelief that she would still be here in 5 years. He listened with a quiet anger that he did not perform but that she could see in the stillness around his eyes. "It isn't right," he said. "A person does the work, they should have the land." "They should," she said. "I intend to." He believed her entirely. He noticed, with the part of himself that noticed things and then tried to be sensible about them, that she had begun to look forward to his visits in a way she did not entirely conceal, though she did not advertise it either. She would have coffee ready when she heard Calhoun coming up the 2-track. She had made a second cup a habit. She would sometimes have something to show him, a repair she had completed, a passage from a book she had been turning over in her mind, a small sketch of the mountains she had made on a quiet evening. She showed these things with the controlled casualness of someone who cares more than they are ready to say, and he received them with the same controlled care. On the Friday before Christmas, he rode out with a package wrapped in cloth that he had tied to his saddlebag with some difficulty and a moderate amount of creative language on his part. When he came through the gate and she appeared in the doorway with her coffee, he untied the package and held it out. "It's Christmas soon," he said, by way of explanation for why a practical man was delivering something wrapped in cloth. She took the package with an expression that balanced perfectly between pleased and uncertain, which was an expression he was beginning to recognize as her particular version of being moved by something. She unwrapped it at the table. It was a set of 3 books. He had ordered them from a catalog through the Mercantile in Harlan Creek weeks before, planning ahead in a way he had never planned ahead for anyone. A new novel that had been reviewed favorably in a newspaper he had borrowed from Callaway. A technical volume on water table management for dryland farming that he thought was genuinely the most useful thing he could give someone building a homestead in the New Mexico territory. And a volume of collected poetry that had caught his eye because the cover was the same color as her eyes, which was a reason he absolutely did not intend to mention. Pearl Talbot sat across the table from him and looked at the books for a moment that was long enough that the fire popped twice in the silence. Isaiah, she said, which was the first time she had used his first name without the preceding formality of his surname, and it came out with a quality that made the name feel different than it had ever felt before. It's practical, he said, because he was not ready either. The farming book especially. She looked up at him. It's not entirely practical, she said. There was something open in her face that he had not quite seen before, something beneath the self-possession, something warmer and more uncertain. No, he admitted, not entirely. The moment balanced on its own edge, fine and precarious, and then she looked back at the books and straightened them with deliberate care, and he looked at the fire, and the moment passed into something that was not gone but had simply become part of the room, part of the air between them. She gave him a gift in return. She had made it herself, which he had not expected. It was a small leather pouch, tooled with a fine geometric pattern along the edges, the kind of work that required patience and a good eye and considerable skill. "For your notebook," she said, entirely practically. "That cover is wearing through." He took it from her hands, their fingers briefly adjacent in the transfer, and felt the warmth of proximity and the particular kind of restraint that is not distance, but its opposite, the restraint of caring very much. "Thank you," he said. "Merry Christmas, Isaiah Abbott," she said. "Merry Christmas, Pearl Talbot," he said. January came with cold and wind and a low sky the color of iron. Isaiah rode out every other week when the weather permitted it, and on the weeks when the road was too bad to travel, he found himself in the bunkhouse restless and distracted in a way that the other hands noticed without commenting on, because cowboys understood a great deal about a man's interior weather without needing to discuss it. On a Saturday in late January, he arrived at the homestead in the early afternoon and found Pearl in the barn with one of her goats, a situation that was clearly not going well. The goat was in distress. It had been kidding since the previous night, she told him, and something was wrong with the position of the kid. Her face was tired and strained in a way he had never seen before, the self-possession still present but stretched thin over something that was genuinely frightening. He had delivered enough calves in his time to know what to do. He rolled up his sleeve and did what needed doing, quietly and without drama, and 20 minutes later there were two small goats in the world that had not been there before, both breathing, both fine. The mother goat turned to inspect them with the businesslike interest of a goat who has decided that whatever just happened is simply over now. Pearl sat back on the barn floor with her knees pulled up and her back against the barn wall and pressed her hands over her face for a moment. Her shoulders shook once briefly, and then she pulled them straight again. When she lowered her hands, her eyes were bright. "Thank you," she said very quietly. He sat down on the barn floor beside her, not inappropriately close but close enough, because she looked as though she had been alone with her worry for too long. "It was nothing," he said. "It wasn't nothing," she said, and looked at him directly in the way she always did when she was about to say something she considered important. "Isaiah, I want to tell you something and I need you to hear it clearly. I'm listening. I have built this place by myself," she said. "I have done it deliberately and with intention, and I am proud of it, and I have not needed anyone to save me or fix my life or take anything over." She paused. I also know the difference between needing someone and wanting someone to be here, and I want you to be here." She stopped, and her chin lifted slightly in the way it did when she was being brave about something. "I don't say that to complicate things. I say it because it's true and because I think you should know it." Isaiah Abbott looked at this woman sitting on the floor of a cold January barn with hay in her hair and tiredness in her face and absolute clear-eyed honesty in her eyes, and he felt something in him finally let go of the careful practical restraint he had been carrying since October. "Pearl," he said. "Yes. I have thought about you every day since I found your initials on that fence post," he said. "Not as a project or a problem to solve, just you. I have ridden 40 miles on a reasonable excuse so many times that old prude at the mercantile has started giving me a significant look when I come in to buy supplies." He paused. "I want to be here too, if you want me here." The barn was quiet except for the new goats making their first small experimental sounds and Calhoun shifting his feet in the paddock outside. "I want you here," Pearl said. He took her hand carefully, "the way you handle something that matters," and she let him, and they sat together on the cold floor of the barn in January while the new goats found their legs, and it was not complicated and it was not small. Spring came to the New Mexico territory in the way it always did, slowly at first and then all at once. The scrubland going green in what felt like a single week. The meadowlarks returning to the fence lines. The mornings losing their iron cold and becoming something you could stand in without a coat and feel the sun on your face. Isaiah was spending more time at the homestead now, riding out on Fridays and returning to the Calloway ranch on Mondays. And Garrett Calloway had looked at him one day with the knowing squint of a man who has seen this particular sequence of events before and said only, "I assume you're going to need some time off regular like." And Isaiah had said, "I am," and Calloway had said, "Fine." Because Isaiah was the best fence man he had, and there are some negotiations that a wise employer simply does not attempt. They worked the homestead together through March and April. Isaiah doing the heavy fence work and the grading on the new kitchen garden beds while Pearl directed, because it was her homestead, and she knew exactly what it needed, and he understood and respected that entirely. They planted together in May, kneeling side by side in the dark soil, with seed packets from the mercantile, and a plan Pearl had laid out on paper over the winter with the thoroughness of a woman who has been thinking hard about something for months. There were beans and corn and squash and kitchen herbs, and a long row of sunflowers that Pearl said were not practical but were important, and Isaiah agreed that they were important. One evening in May, they sat on the front porch in the long light after supper, the kind of evening that makes even difficult lives feel like gifts, and Isaiah was quiet for a time in the way he sometimes was, which Pearl had learned to read as thinking rather than withdrawal. The distinction mattered and she had noticed it. "There's something I've been wanting to ask you," he said. "Ask it," she said. She was sitting with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, looking at the way the last sun was turning the distant mesas to copper, and she said it without any particular alarm because she had learned to trust the texture of his silences. "I have some money set aside," he said. 3 years of wages, mostly unspent because there has never been much to spend it on." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about the northern section of the homestead, the part that backs up against the creek. If you filed an adjacent claim and proved it up alongside this one, it would double what you've got. The water access alone would make the difference between a working ranch and a serious one." He paused. "I could help you prove it up." Pearl looked at him steadily. "When you say help me prove it up, I mean I'd like to marry you," he said plainly without preamble in the way he did most things. "If you'd want that, I'm not asking you to give anything up or change what you've built. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me be part of it." He looked at the mesas too for a moment and then back at her. "I know what this land means to you. I know you didn't come out here to be somebody's wife. I'm not asking you to be somebody's wife. I'm asking you to be my wife, which I think is a different thing, if you'll let it be." Pearl Talbot looked at Isaiah Abbott in the copper light of a May evening in 1883, and the look on her face was the kind that bypasses all the careful layers a person builds around the truest and most valuable parts of themselves and goes directly to those parts without knocking first. "It is a different thing," she said. "Is that a yes?" She reached across the space between the two porch chairs and took his hand. "That's a yes," she said. They were married in Harlan Creek in June, in the small church at the north end of town, with Garrett Calloway and his wife attending as witnesses and Walt Prout from the Mercantile making an unlikely but genuine best man based on the fact that he was, as he pointed out with considerable self-satisfaction, technically responsible for the whole enterprise. The preacher was a young man from Ohio who had been in the territory less than a year and still looked mildly surprised by most of what he encountered. But he read the words clearly and with good intention, and Pearl and Isaiah said them back with the directness and precision that characterized everything they did. Pearl wore a dress she had made herself from cloth she had ordered through the Mercantile over the winter, a blue-gray that was not quite the color of her eyes but was in the neighborhood, with careful work at the collar and cuffs that showed what she could do with a needle when she chose to apply herself to it. She wore her hair down for the first time Isaiah had ever seen it, and the effect was considerable. He wore his best shirt and his good hat and his boots that he had polished until they reflected light, and Garrett Calloway's wife had pressed his jacket that morning, with the gentle iron authority of a woman who will accept no imperfection in the presentation of people she has decided to champion. After the ceremony, Walt Prout opened a bottle of good whiskey that he had been saving for an unspecified occasion and declared that this qualified, and they stood outside the church in the summer light and drank to things going right, which was the best toast anyone could think of, and which everyone agreed was entirely sufficient. They rode back to the homestead together in the evening, Isaiah on Calhoun and Pearl on the chestnut mare she had acquired over the winter in a trade that involved 2 jars of preserved peaches, and a complicated negotiation with a passing rancher that Isaiah had watched with complete admiration. The land was lit gold, and the air smelled of sage, and the summer grass was high and green alongside the road, and they rode side by side in the long, comfortable silence of 2 people who have stopped needing to fill quiet with words. At the homestead gate, Isaiah dismounted and held his hand out to help Pearl down from the chestnut, and she took it, and when she was on the ground they stood very close in the last of the evening light. "I should carry you over the threshold," he said, with a small amount of the dry humor that came out in him sometimes, like water finding its way through stone. "You should try it and find out what happens," she said. He laughed. She laughed. They went inside together. The summer was the fullest Isaiah Abbott could remember. They worked the homestead together with a combined energy that surprised even Pearl, who had never lacked for determination, but who found that determination doubled when it had somewhere to go besides the interior of her own head. They expanded the garden, repaired the barn roof, dug a new root cellar, and spent 3 days of July replanting the north pasture with better grass seed. Isaiah filed the adjacent claim in early July and began the process of proving it up, which involved considerably more paperwork than either of them had anticipated and considerably more trips to the land office in Harlan Creek, where the clerk had replaced his previous expression of patient disbelief with something closer to cautious respect now that there was a man involved, which was an injustice that Pearl noted and Isaiah understood, and neither of them had the power to fully fix, but both of them named clearly, which felt like the least they could do. In the evenings, they sat on the porch or at the table and read, or talked, or played cards badly in the lamplight, and these evenings were among the best things Isaiah Abbott had ever known, the quiet companionship of 2 people who genuinely liked each other, which is a rarer foundation than love and is what love grows best in. In September, a year to the month from the afternoon Isaiah had found the initials on the fence post, Pearl told him over breakfast that she was expecting a child. She said it looking directly at him across the table, with the steady, clear gaze that was her natural mode, because there was nothing she did without directness, and he looked at her for a moment in the way of a man whose interior world has just shifted substantially on its axis. Then he put down his coffee cup and came around the table and took her face in both his hands, gently, and looked at her with something in his eyes that had no practical name, but that she recognized immediately and returned with the same. "A baby," he said, very quietly. "A baby," she confirmed, with equal quiet, and then the smile that had always lived close beneath her surface broke through fully and completely, and it was one of the finest things he had ever seen. They told Walt Prout the next time they came into town for supplies, because Prout had appointed himself an unofficial family member in the months since the wedding and would have been genuinely injured to be told last. He shook Isaiah's hand with a force that suggested strong feeling and then turned to Pearl and said, "I always knew you'd be all right," which made Pearl say, "I know you did, Walt," with a warmth that was genuine, and that surprised Prout enough that he cleared his throat and busied himself with something behind the counter. Garrett Calloway, when he heard, said only, "Good," and then thought about it and added, "That's good, Abbott," which from Calloway was approximately equivalent to a lengthy and emotional speech, and Isaiah received it as such. The pregnancy progressed through the autumn without serious difficulty, though the nausea of the first months was considerable, and Pearl endured it with the same private determined efficiency she brought to everything, which meant she got on with the work and said very little about it except when she needed to, at which point she said exactly what she needed and expected it to be taken seriously, and Isaiah took it seriously. Stepping into the work she set aside without being asked to, and doing it the way she preferred it done because he had been paying attention. He took over the heavier barn work. He cooked 2 out of every 3 meals, which was an education in itself since his previous culinary experience had been largely limited to bunkhouse fare. But Pearl's cookbook collection was thorough, and she was a good teacher when she was feeling well, and his biscuits had become genuinely excellent by October. She told him this with the kind of specific and sincere compliment she gave when she meant something, which made it worth considerably more than a generic compliment would have been. One afternoon in November, Pearl was sitting by the window with her sewing, and the afternoon light was making one of its arguments for the beauty of the world, and Isaiah was sitting across from her reading, and the room was warm and quiet and smelled of the corn chowder that was on the stove, and he looked up from his book and looked at her in the window light and thought with the completeness and clarity of a thought that is also a kind of arrival, that he was the most fortunate man in the New Mexico territory and probably in a considerably wider radius than that. "What?" she said, without looking up from her sewing because she always knew when he was looking at her. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking." "Think quieter," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved, and he looked back at his book and smiled. The winter came and they moved through it as they moved through everything together, and with purpose, and with the warmth of 2 people who have made the deliberate choice of each other and have not regretted it. Isaiah wrote to a cousin in Texas he had not corresponded with in years, partly to share the news of the baby, and partly because the experience of building a life that felt genuinely worth reporting on had made him want to reach back out to the people he had let go quiet. Pearl wrote letters, too, to a woman she had known in Wichita who had been a friend before Pearl left. The correspondence had lapsed in the difficult first year of homesteading, but Pearl revived it now, and the letters that came back were full of pleased surprise and genuine warmth. In late January, Isaiah completed the fence line on the adjacent claim, a project he had been working on through the fall, running new wire along all 4 sides of the northern parcel, setting the posts deep and solid. He wanted it done before spring. He wanted everything in order. The baby was born on a Thursday evening in early March of 1884, delivered with the assistance of a woman from Harlan Creek named Mrs. Fenton, who was the closest thing the territory had to a midwife, and who came out to the homestead without complaint when Isaiah rode hard to town to fetch her. It was a long evening and a longer night, and Isaiah spent most of it doing what men of his era were required to do, which was to wait in the next room and be simultaneously useless and desperately, entirely invested in what was happening. When Mrs. Fenton came out and said, "It's a boy and they're both fine." He did something he had not done since he was 11 years old, which was to put his face in his hands for a moment, and Mrs. Fenton was gracious enough to find something to examine in the other direction. He went in. Pearl was lying in the bed with the baby in the crook of her arm, tired in a way that went all the way through her, but with something in her face, a light, a particular quality of wonder, that was unlike anything he had ever seen on any face. The baby was very small and very red, and appeared to have strong opinions about being in the world, which he expressed with considerable volume. "He's loud," Isaiah said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "He is," Pearl agreed with a tired and radiant smile. "He takes after me." Isaiah looked at his son, which was a phrase that had no precedent in his interior landscape, and which was going to require considerable time to feel real, and then looked at Pearl, and found nothing at all adequate to say, and so said nothing and put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned into him with the full weight of her exhaustion, and the baby continued to express his opinions, and it was fine. Everything was fine. They named him Samuel after Pearl's father, whose full name had been Samuel Talbot, schoolteacher of Wichita, lover of books and open land, who had given his daughter everything useful she had ever needed, and who would have been, Pearl said quietly, very pleased about all of this. Isaiah thought that was probably right. Samuel Abbott grew at the rate babies grow, which is disconcertingly fast, and which both Isaiah and Pearl found themselves repeatedly unprepared for, despite being, in every other respect, extremely capable and competent people. He sat up by summer and was walking, or attempting to walk, which was more accurately described as controlled falling, by the following spring. He had Pearl's gray-green eyes and Isaiah's dark hair, and a temperament that seemed to be trying to balance both of his parents' constitutions in a small and determined body. The homestead grew too. By the time Samuel was walking, both claims were fully proved up and recorded. Pearl's original claim and the adjacent northern parcel, 160 acres combined, all of it legally and completely theirs. Isaiah had left his work at the Calloway Ranch the previous fall with Calloway's gruff blessing, and the understanding that he was welcome back any time, which was the highest compliment Calloway knew how to give. He and Pearl ran the homestead together, adding a small herd of cattle to the goats in the second year, and a proper vegetable enterprise in the third, selling produce and eventually dried goods to the mercantile in Harlan Creek in an arrangement that suited both parties. One evening in the summer of 1885, when Samuel was 15 months old and sleeping with the profound commitment of a child who has spent the day falling down and getting back up approximately 40 times, Isaiah and Pearl sat on the front porch in the warm night air with cups of coffee and the comfortable shared silence that had become one of the best textures of their life. "I want to do something," Pearl said. "You always want to do something," he said, which was true, and which he said with the particular tone that meant he was glad of it. "I want to build something new on the north parcel," she said, "a proper structure, big enough for what we might eventually need." He looked at her in the lamplight that spilled out from the window, at the careful, deliberate way she had said that last part. "Pearl," he said. "I think we might need more room," she said, and there was the almost smile at the corner of her mouth that he had loved since the first time he saw it. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. "Is that right?" he said. "I believe it is," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and she turned her hand to hold his back, and they sat in the warm summer dark with the crickets going, and the stars very bright above the mesa and the land around them, their land, all of it quiet and full and entirely their own. The building project began in early autumn, when the worst of the summer heat had broken, and the days were long enough to work in but cool enough to be comfortable. Isaiah drew up the plans himself, consulting with Pearl at every stage, and the result was a design that was practical and solid, and had a large kitchen and 3 bedrooms, and a proper covered porch that faced south to catch the winter sun. They hired 2 men from Harlan Creek to help with the heavy framing work, honest men whom Pearl had assessed and approved, because she assessed everyone, and Walt Pruitt's son, a capable young man of 18 who was looking for work, who turned out to be a talented carpenter with an instinct for good joinery that impressed everyone, including himself. The frame went up in September and the walls in October, and by the first frost the roof was on and the windows were in. Pearl made curtains for the windows from cloth she had been gathering all summer, and they hung them together on a cold November afternoon while Samuel sat on the floor and attempted to eat a curtain ring and had to be redirected. "It's a good house," Isaiah said, standing back and looking at it in the late autumn light. "It is," Pearl said beside him. "Your father's house," she said softly, which she said to Samuel, who was now in Isaiah's arms and who regarded the house with the open philosophical curiosity of a 1-year-old who finds the world entirely interesting. They moved into the new house before Christmas. The old house, Pearl's original Draper homestead, became a working storage and workspace, which suited it well. The new house smelled of fresh-cut wood and the pine tar they had used on the exterior, and the rosemary and cedar Pearl had hung in the corners because she believed in such things, which Isaiah did not precisely believe in but equally did not disbelieve in, because he had enough respect for things he did not fully understand. The second child was a girl, born the following October, and they named her Clara, after no one in particular, but because Pearl had loved the name since she was young. Clara was quieter than Samuel by nature, or appeared so at first, though by the time she was 2 it became clear that her quietness was the particular variety that is actually very focused attention to everything happening around her, which was going to be a formidable quality in a few more years. She had Isaiah's dark eyes and Pearl's directness, which combination gave Pruitt genuine pause when he met her, and he said to Isaiah privately, "That child is going to run something someday," and Isaiah said, "I know," with complete pride. The years settled into the shape of the life they had built, which was a good shape not without its difficulties, because no life was, but with a fundamental solidity and warmth that held through the difficulties and came out the other side of them intact. There were hard seasons, a drought in the summer of 1886 that put real strain on the cattle, and required difficult decisions about water management that kept both Isaiah and Pearl up late into many nights, talking through options with the shared pragmatic intelligence they brought to every serious problem. They came through it with the herd reduced but intact, and Pearl's water table management plan, drawn from the book Isaiah had given her that first Christmas and refined over 3 years of practical application, was what made the difference. Isaiah told her this directly, and she accepted it the same way, without false modesty or excessive pride. It was simply what was true. There was a dispute with a rancher to the south named Holden, who had ideas about the southern boundary of the combined homestead that did not match the land office records. Isaiah handled the legal portion of it with a methodical patience that surprised Holden, who had expected either capitulation or violence and got neither. Pearl handled the personal portion of it by presenting Holden with copies of every land office document they held, organized chronologically and annotated in her clear, precise hand, and saying to him, very calmly and very directly, that she had been through too much to surrender 1 inch of what she had earned, and that he was welcome to take the matter to court if he felt strongly about it. Holden did not feel strongly enough about it to take it to court. Walt Pruitt retired from the mercantile in 1887 and sold to a younger man, but he remained in Harlan Creek and continued to take a proprietary interest in the Abbott family's affairs, which they tolerated with affection because he had earned it. He died peacefully in the winter of 1889 and left, among his small estate, a note addressed to Pearl that said only, "I always knew you'd be all right." Pearl put the note in the leather-bound box where she kept the things that mattered most and said nothing for a while, and Isaiah sat beside her in the quiet until she was ready to speak again. In 1888, Isaiah rode out one morning to the far eastern edge of their property, a habit of his, this periodic riding of the perimeters, born of the same instinct that had started everything. And then, on an impulse, he kept riding. He rode west, past the Callaway spread, out to the old fence line where it had all begun. He found the cedar post without difficulty, the same post he had crouched over 6 years before with the last of the day's light catching those 2 burned letters. PT, it was still there. The wood was grayer, the post listing slightly in the softened ground of another wet spring, but the brand was still clear and deep. He crouched down the way he had that first afternoon, and pressed his thumb into the grooves of those letters, and the feeling that passed through him was layered in a way that simple feelings are not. It was the memory of that afternoon, the strangeness of that first pull of curiosity, and something unnamed. And it was everything that had grown from those 2 letters like a tree grows from a seed, enormous and alive and rooted deep. He pulled out his knife and carefully, with some work because the old wood was hard as iron, carved 2 more letters into the post below hers. IA, he sat back on his heels and looked at the 4 letters together for a moment. PT and IA. He thought that was right. He thought that was exactly right. He rode the 40 miles home in the afternoon sun, through the scrubland going green gold with the particular generosity of a May that means what it says. And when he came up the 2-track and over the low rise and saw the homestead spread below him, the new house solid and bright in the afternoon, the kitchen garden laid out in its neat rows, the goats in the paddock with 2 new additions this spring, the children somewhere in the yard because he could hear Samuel's high voice carrying on the wind and Pearl's answering it with something that made Samuel laugh. He felt the fullness of the thing he had made, the thing they had made together, with the weight and warmth of something that is real and permanent. Pearl was at the garden fence when he rode through the gate, wearing the canvas work apron and the pushed-back bonnet that he had seen her in 1,000 times and would never stop seeing as though for the first time in some particular quality of light. She shaded her eyes with one hand and watched him come. "You were gone all day," she said when he dismounted. "Rode out west," he said. "Far west." She looked at him with those eyes. "How far west?" "Far enough," he said, with the quiet private humor that was always directed at her and at her alone. She knew immediately. He could tell by the way her face changed, not dramatically, just in that interior way that he had learned to read over 6 years, and that he thought he would still be learning in 30 more, which was a prospect he found entirely appealing. "You went back to the fence post," she said. "I did." "Why?" He took Calhoun's reins in one hand and offered the other to her, and she took it with the practiced ease of a woman who has been taking this particular hand for years and has no intention of stopping. "Because it was where everything started," he said, "and because I wanted to see it again." He paused. "I left something there." "What did you leave?" "My initials," he said, "below yours." He looked at her in the late afternoon light, this woman who had burned her mark into the edge of the world and waited, not for rescue, not for anything she had not already determined to provide for herself, but simply because she deserved to be here and had decided to be here, and had made that decision with the full force of everything she had. "Seemed right," he said. "Seemed like the place where the story started ought to know how the story turned out." Pearl Talbot Abbott looked at her husband in the golden afternoon on the land they had proved up together, and her hand tightened on his with the specific pressure of someone who does not take a single thing for granted. "How has it turned out?" she asked, and there was something light in her voice, something that had come a long way from the careful wariness of that first day, that first woman standing in a doorway with a shotgun and a chin raised against the world. "Better than I could have invented," he said honestly. Samuel came running across the yard then at the full committed speed of a 4-year-old who runs everywhere because walking is simply not interesting enough, and skidded to a stop against Isaiah's legs and grabbed a fistful of his trouser leg. "Papa," he announced, "there is a frog in the root cellar." "Is there?" Isaiah said. "A big one," Samuel said, with the absolute authority of a child describing a fact of tremendous importance. "Mama says you have to deal with it." Isaiah looked at Pearl. "I said he should go wait for you," Pearl said, which was not precisely the same thing, but which Isaiah understood to be an invitation, and he swung Samuel up onto his hip and turned toward the house. Clara was on the porch, sitting with great seriousness over the small peg doll that her grandmother in Wichita had sent through the mail, which was a grandmother she had never met but whose letters came regularly and were read aloud at the supper table. Clara looked up when they came up the porch steps and said, with the considered calm that was entirely her own, "The frog is under the second shelf. I have been watching him." "Good intelligence," Isaiah said. "I know," Clara said, and returned to her doll. The frog was relocated to the creek with appropriate ceremony. Supper was cornbread and beans and the last of the autumn's preserved tomatoes, and they ate it together at the big table in the warm kitchen with the lamp lit, and the children arguing in the amiable way of children who are comfortable enough to argue. And Pearl watched Isaiah settle a disagreement between them about whose turn it was to feed the goats tomorrow with the patient fairness he brought to everything. And she felt, as she felt every day in various and specific ways, the rightness of this. The complete, unambiguous rightness of the life she was living. After supper, after the children were in bed, after the kitchen was set in order and the lamp in the front room was turned down to a comfortable warmth, they sat together on the porch in the evening air, the way they had done so many evenings in all the years since that first evening when he had asked her if he could come back, and she had said yes with the full understanding of what she was saying yes to. The sky over the mesa was immense and starred, and the nighthawks were calling in the dark air above the pasture, and the summer grass moved in a warm wind that smelled of the land, their land, all of it, 160 acres of claimed and proved and earned ground, and it was quiet and it was good and it was theirs. "Isaiah," Pearl said. "Yes." "I'm glad you found that fence post," she said. He turned to look at her in the dark, at the shape of her in the warm night, the person she was, fully and entirely herself, always, the self-possession that had never diminished but had opened, over years of being met with equal care and equal honesty, into something larger and more generous than self-possession alone, into a warmth that was directed outward at the world and most particularly and most fully at him. "So am I," he said. "God, Pearl, so am I." She reached across the space between their chairs and found his hand in the dark, and he took hers, and they sat together under the enormous western sky, while the stars turned slowly in their old familiar patterns above the mesa, and the land lay quiet around them. And inside the house, the children slept with the complete and trusting peace of children who have never had reason to doubt that the world is safe and full and good, which was the finest thing Isaiah Abbott and Pearl Talbot Abbott had ever made together. Finer than any fence or field or proper house. This life, this warm and anchored and deliberate life, built from two initials burned into an old cedar post at the edge of the world. And from a man who had enough sense and enough heart to ride 40 miles to find out whose they were. In the spring of the following year, Pearl ordered a new iron from the catalog, a small, careful iron, no wider than 2 fingers. When it arrived, she rode out one Saturday afternoon on the chestnut mare with Isaiah beside her on Calhoun, all the way to the far edge of their southern property line, to the new cedar post they had set themselves the previous fall when they had mended that stretch of fence. She built a small fire in the open ground beside the post and heated the iron in it while Isaiah held the horses, and the late April sun warmed the scrubland around them and a hawk sailed in a long, slow circle overhead. When the iron was ready, she crouched at the new post with the precision and patience she brought to everything that mattered, and she pressed it into the clean, pale wood. PT and IA, both sets of initials together, permanent and clear, a mark that said, "Here. We were here. We built something real and lasting here. 2 people who found each other at the edge of the world and decided to make the world larger by staying." She straightened up and looked at what she had done, and then looked at Isaiah, who was looking at the post with an expression that he was not attempting to manage or contain. "There," she said. "There," he agreed. She took her horse's reins and put her foot in the stirrup and turned the chestnut mare toward home, toward the house, the children, the land, the life, and Isaiah rode beside her through the spring afternoon, and the grass was high and green on either side of the road, and the sky above the mesas was that particular blue that existed nowhere else in the world, and ahead of them, at the end of the two-track trail, was everything they had made and everything they intended to keep making, for as long as the world would allow them, which they both intended to be a very long time indeed.